Mario Draghi, the former president of the European Central Bank, famously saved the euro with his do whatever it takes declaration in 2012. Now he's back with a new report on Europe's future competitiveness. And let's be honest, it could not come at a better time. The European economy isn't exactly thriving. Take this example. Back in 2002, the GDP gap between the EU and the US was just 15 percentage points. Fast forward to today, and that gap has widened to 30 percentage points. Not great, right? So what's going wrong? Well, it turns out that 72% of this widening gap can be attributed to one key issue: growth. To address this, Draghi has outlined 170 key recommendations in a 400-page report, urging EU leaders to make some tough decisions to stop the economic slide and prevent social unrest. And yes, we went through all 400 pages, so you don't have to. But it's not all bad. The EU has created a single market of 440 million consumers and 23 million companies, accounting for around 17% of global GDP. The EU's approach has also delivered impressive outcomes in governance, health, education, and environmental protection. In fact, 8 of the world's top 10 countries for the rule of law are EU members. Europe even leads the US and China in life expectancy and infant mortality rates. Still, there are significant challenges, and Draghi warns that if these issues are not addressed, the EU will die a slow and agonizing death. So what's holding Europe back? Draghi points to several factors, some of which are external. Trade is slowing down, for example, because markets like China are now producing their own goods and focusing on internal consumption, reducing demand for European exports. Energy is another big one. Europe used to rely on cheap natural gas from Russia, but that pipeline has basically dried up. And then there's security. Europe has leaned heavily on the US for defense, which weakened its own defense sector, once a major source of innovation. But according to Draghi, the biggest issue of all is Europe's lack of productivity. This graph shows EU versus US labor productivity from 1890 to 2022, and you can clearly see that Europe made incredible progress from the end of World War II to the end of the century, almost catching up with the US. However, since then, productivity has slipped back down to around 80%, and this is unlikely to improve anytime soon. The key driver behind the growing productivity gap between the EU and the US is digital technology. And this brings us to Draghi's first recommendation, closing the innovation gap between the EU and major competitors like the US and China. Europe has failed to fully capitalize on the first digital revolution, led by the internet. For instance, no EU company founded in the last 50 years has reached a market value of 100 billion euros or more, while all 6 US companies worth over 1 trillion euros were created in that time.
Since 2008, close to 30% of the so-called unicorns, namely companies that will go to be valued more than 1 billion euros, unicorns that had started in the European Union, have left, and the majority of them went to the United States. So 30% of our most successful innovators have moved. And this has to change. Europe must become a place where innovation flourishes, especially for digital tech.
Innovative digital companies in Europe are simply struggling to scale and secure funding, especially compared to the US. The gap in later stage financing is huge, with US venture capital investment being 5 times higher than in Europe across all